Thank you so much. An individual was invited to give the commencement address at David Jones's alma mater, Yale, and he decided to use the acrostic model and spend time on each one of the letters. And he spent 30 minutes on each letter, which meant that his presentation was about 2 hours. And after his presentation, someone asked, well, what do you think about what he said? And they responded, well, I'm just glad that I'm graduating from Yale and not MIT. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They would have been there all day. In the Chinese culture, they often say that there are 5 points on every map instead of, in Western culture, 4 points on the map. We say in Western culture there's north, south, east, and west, but in many Asian cultures they say there's 5 points on a map. North, south, east, west, and where you are. And of the 5 points on the map for many Asian cultures, where you are is pivotal. For example, if you wanted to come to this event, you're from out of town, you don't know where the Kentucky Center for the Performing Arts is located, so you call someone here and say, I'm lost. Well, they're going to ask you this question: where are you? Because only when you tell them where you are and you know where you are, can you navigate where you need to be, or can they help you navigate where you need to be? And knowing where you are is sometimes difficult to face. We don't always like to acknowledge where we really are as a community. We love to delude ourselves. But it's important to know where you are. James Baldwin, the great activist of a former generation, said, you cannot fix what you won't face. So with that in mind, the question is, where are we, especially as it relates to all segments of our community in general and West Louisville in particular? Where are we? Well, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, I think here's an image that I think captures the challenges not only of West Louisville, but many Midwestern urban areas. In the 60s, there was a sense of radicalness, of transformation, of change, of changing our society and changing our culture so that all persons, regardless of their race, would have opportunities. And on the top, you see African-American women proud with their naturals, proud of their heritage, and determined to make transformational change in the United States. But if you fast forward to 2010, a new image of African American women. And the question is, what has happened? What has happened since 68 or since the 50s that now, in many people's minds, this is the caricature that they have of African American women? Or here's another one. The picture on my left is an actual image of African American males at a historical black college or university, and that was the image that African Americans had of themselves. This is what we aspired to be. On the right, here's the image that many African Americans, especially African Americans who live in the community in which I have lived my entire adult life, West Louisville. This is what they aspire to be. This is what I see and come in contact with on a daily basis. And the question is, what happened? Well, this is what has happened. The failed promises of integration. That integration has not fully embraced what it intentionally set out to do. That instead of true integration, we have settled for interaction, but not authentic integration. This decade, we will celebrate the 50-year milestone of many important civil rights gains of the 60s. It began last year because the 60s was a pivotal decade. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. And last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of that. This year, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of public accommodations. In 1965, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And in 1968, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of open housing. It's interesting that the last gain of the civil rights era of the 60s, open housing, is really the fact that has caused us to maintain different communities instead of having global communities all over Louisville. It's the last one. Because while we interact in our school systems and interact at events in our malls, when I go to the Yum Center to see the Cardinals play, I see interaction between people of different races, different cultures, different ethnicities. But as soon as I leave the Yum Center and I start making my way home on Broadway, the traffic thins out as I start going towards Broadway, because while there was interaction in the Yum Center, we live in separate neighborhoods in which there is not authentic integration. It's interesting that in terms of integration, there are two Montgomerys. There's Montgomery, Alabama, where the civil rights movement started on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat. But there's also Montgomery County, Maryland, where in the 70s, they decided that for every major housing upstart, upscale housing upstart, that 15% of the houses in those new upstart communities would be for low-income people, which has resulted in residential integration in Montgomery County, Maryland. Unfortunately, in Louisville, when open housing took place in 1968, what happened was it created hyper-segregation for the poor in West Louisville. When I was younger and grew up in West Louisville, I only knew one white person. The elementary school that I attended, Stephen Foster Elementary School, had no whites. So I went my first 6 years not knowing any whites. There was none in my neighborhood, none in my elementary school. But one thing I did have going for me in West Louisville at the time was that while we were racially segregated, we were not economically and class segregated, because in my neighborhood, I had prominent African Americans, doctors and lawyers. Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother lived down the street from me. My mother, who was a piano teacher, taught his children, Vernon and Darlene. When I was a kid, on one occasion in the basement of my house, she was teaching Darlene and Vernon King, A.D. Williams King's children. I was running in the basement and tripped over someone's feet. I looked up, and guess who it was? It was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had visited his brother. And my neighborhood was Dr. Moses, who was the first pediatrician hired by Jewish Hospital, lived around the corner from me. On Grand Street lived Muhammad Ali. Down the street was Frederick G. Sampson, one of the preeminent orators of the 20th century. All these people lived in my neighborhood. You know, you had two television programs that black people loved in the early 70s. One was called The Jeffersons, and one was called Good Times. And in 68, 69, the Jeffersons, George Jefferson and James Evans, who was a blue-collar worker, and George Jefferson, who was an entrepreneur who owned a cleaning service, lived in the same neighborhood. But then what happened was, when open housing took place, the theme song of the Jeffersons personifies what happened. The Jeffersons moved on up to the east side, and James Evans was stuck with Good Times. And if you listen to the theme song of Good Times, it really wasn't good times. And since that time, we've experienced that balkanization, that continued separation, where African Americans in urban areas experience what Dr. Martin Luther King called social isolation, economic deprivation, and emotional frustration. Dr. King said in his first book, Strive Towards Freedom, that the segregationists argued that we must isolate African Americans because of their behavior. And Dr. King said they've got it backwards. The reason they behave the way they do is because they have been segregated. It's the Herman the Munster syndrome. If you remember Herman the Munster in the 60s, Herman the Munster, the problem with the Munsters is that the Munsters don't know they're Munsters. Because in their socially isolated world, abnormality has become normal. They think it's normal to be a Frankenstein, to have a wife who's a witch, a son who's a werewolf, and a grandfather who's a vampire. They think that's normal because in an abnormal situation, normality gets misdiagnosed as abnormalities. So in the socially isolated world west of 9th Street, there are many African Americans who are living in that world, and that's their reality, the sagging pants, the devaluing of education. They think that's normal. So the question then is, what are we going to do about those who've been left and those, for African Americans who have moved out of West Louisville, which has created, as I said, hyper-segregation, because now not only are the poor racially segregated in terms of housing and where you live determines what you will be exposed to. So what are we going to do now that you have class segregation because the Jeffersons have moved on out to the east side? If you ask the average African-American kid who lives in the California community where St. Stephen Church is, talk to them and ask them, name me someone you know who has been in jail, who has multiple children, never been married, unemployed. They would need both hands and their toes on their feet. Then ask them, name me 5 people who've graduated from college. Name me someone who's been married for a length of time, who's not gone to jail, and they would be hard-pressed to name 5 persons, and I'm being generous by naming 5. So what then can we do, since this is where we are? Because the Chinese say that the most important point on a map is where you are. This is what we must do. We must create institutions in West Louisville that become paths out of poverty. And one of those institutions is Simmons College of Kentucky. It's a historical black college university that is accredited. There are historical black colleges and universities represent 3% of the colleges and universities in America, but yet they educate over 30% of first-time baccalaureate degreed African Americans. And we have an institution now that is accredited, and in a month will become a historical black college and university because Simmons is the oldest black college in the state of Kentucky and the oldest black college in America named for an African American, William J. Simmons. My challenge to you is to do what my friend David Jones and others have done, and Kathy has done, and that is to develop some cultural dexterity. And that is feel comfortable being the minority in a predominantly black institution or church or community. It's wonderful to see David integrate St. Stephen Church as the only white boy in the pew. But integrating and feeling comfortable, having cultural dexterity to come to West Louisville and to provide paths for people out of West Louisville, and it's urgent that we do it. If we're on an airplane and we're 30,000 feet in the air, and you are in coach, you're in first class and I'm in coach, and the pilot says, we've got engine problems in coach. Well, just because there's a curtain that separates the two of us, and just because you're eating a full-course meal and I'm drinking half a Coke and some peanuts, don't say, well, that's coach. It has no impact on me because I'm in first class. Because if coach goes down, first class goes down. And if West Louisville goes down, the entire city goes down. But if West Louisville can stay up, then our entire city will stay up also. Thank you.